Welcome back to another episode of the Casey Campbell Podcast. Casey Campbell with you, of course. We're pleased to be joined by Jack Benyon of the Race, of course, who covers IndyCar, and of course, who hosts the Race Indycar Podcast, which is also available on The Athletic. So that's how I wanted to have him on, because I'm a big fan of the podcast, so I just felt like I should have you on. So Jack, how are you?
Thanks, we appreciate that. You've already done a better job of advertising the athletic element of the or any element of my podcast than I usually do. So thank you very much for that. And yeah, it's lovely to be here. I'm always happy to talk to anyone who loves IndyCar racing. Really, I love it so much. I'm always happy to talk about it. So have a lot of fun doing the Races podcast with J.I. Hildebrand. He's a perfect guy to co-host the podcast with. He's got such a wonderful, unique insight into the world of racing, not just in IndyCar. And we spend most of our time offline talking about lots of different series and some of the other stuff that he's up to and some of the other stuff that he's done in his career. So he's like the perfect person for me to host the podcast with. So we have a lot of fun.
Yeah, that's good stuff. So you can check out therace.com, or you can go on The Athletic. That's where I get all of them, because that's how I'm subscribed to that stuff. So yeah. We were just the thing is we were talking about IndyCar, and then we got on of course, NASCAR just leveled a bunch of penalties to Hendrick Motorsports. I think 60 for like this greenhouse. Let me get the most accurate thing out here. I don't want to. I think it's the greenhouse something. It was Byron and Bowman, I think, that got the penalty for that. So that's interesting. So that will be a title for another podcast. That will do. So how about that IndyCar race?
Yeah, it's pretty cool, right? I think there's, Texas has been on at least on track. It's been on a pretty upward trajectory for the past couple of years. I mean, last year we still didn't really get the kind of race-wide, side-by-side racing that you kind of expect from a super speedway like Texas. But I think in the background, if you pay attention to these kind of things, IndyCar has been trying really hard to bring different levels of downforce, different aerodynamic parts to try and help. Obviously, Will Power suggested the brilliant practice session for trying to rubber in the high line last year, which was great. There was no additional NASCAR PJ1 compound added last November, so that was a good thing for IndyCar for the track. And yeah, I think there's just a pretty good feeling around the place. I remember last year, we had this great race, had this last lap pass, Joseph Newgarden, obviously going around the outside of Scotty McLaughlin, and that was all great, but it was done in front of pictures of empty grandstands and, without a significant atmosphere, watching that race. And I think it drew a lot of questions from people as to, the future of the race. And we knew at that point that the promoter agreement with Penske Entertainment was up. So at that point, that could have been the end of Texas and IndyCar, but instead, all the parties involved have kind of doubled down and tried to promote the event better in the local area, tried to get more people involved, tried to improve the on-track, product as much as they can, and they've done a good job of it. I'm not here to, be PR for IndyCar or say how great they are, because there's certain things that I think IndyCar could do better in general, but in this circumstance, I think it's really important. When you spend some of your time criticizing championships or events for what they do, it's important to praise them for when they do get things right as well. And I think that race was just the right balance of, we had a bit of pack racing, but we still had the very best teams and the very best drivers able to show what they could do. Obviously, we saw Pato basically lap the whole field, and yet we still had, a fantastic pack race with a really interesting, finish as well with lots of people involved. So I thought it was a really good balance. I don't want to see like full pack racing back at Texas, because I think we're past that probably from a safety aspect. And I think we're also past that from we want to see these drivers, the very best drivers and the very best teams, the very best engineers, pushing the limits of what's possible and creating the absolute best package of car, driver and team. That's what I want to see, at least anyway. So I felt like we got a good balance of seeing that with Pato and Joseph, but also getting that element of, anyone can win this race when we got to the end. So I thought it was a good balance and really enjoyed the race.
Yeah, for sure. By the way, remember the NASCAR penalty I mentioned earlier? I just want to get this right. 60 points with their interim crew chief suspended 2 races. That starts next week. And then their fines of both teams are fined $75,000. and after their cars were taken to the greenhouse, taken to the R&D center for when they found a greenhouse violation. So I want to make sure I get all that. So that's obviously the big breaking news right now. Okay, back to IndyCar.
It's been an awesome year of NASCAR. I think it's, whether it's on track or off track at the moment, there's just stories everywhere you look, and whether it's Koto with the kind of influx of I guess stars from outside of NASCAR, making that a bit more interesting, and the kind of the trade-off, it seemed to get a little bit silly towards the end of that race with the cautions and the people like bumping each other out of the way and stuff. Like, as a fan of like pure motorsport, that can't be something that you really want to see week to week. But really interesting package they've got with the new car and on road courses. But also the rest of the season's produced so many storylines. We've got Chase Elliott out with a broken leg. We had Kyle Busch kind of resurgent in his new team. We've had loads of really interesting stories to start the year, and some really intriguing people in the playoff positions at the minute as well. So it's going to be great to watch the rest of the year. And this whole Hendrick versus NASCAR penalty saga that seems to be going on at the minute, it's nothing but entertaining for someone from the outside.
Yeah, it really is. And then you add the boycott news from yesterday and the colleague news, and that's it's interesting stuff. So obviously we'll be covering that across the states. Might as well, since we're talking about a lot of this stuff. Let's get your thoughts on F1. How do you think about that? Because we're all going all over the board. So
yeah, it's been, I guess, an interesting start to the year in the sense that I don't really think anyone saw Aston Martin being as competitive as they were going to be, at least not until preseason testing anyway. So that's been an interesting surprise, especially with obviously Fernando making the jump over there. And we've seen him make some driving moves in the past that maybe haven't worked out for him, or haven't been the best moves, not just because he's made a bad decision or anything like that. Sometimes you can't predict how competitive the cars are going to be when you move teams and you don't really know what's going to happen the year following, and things haven't worked out for him. But this one seems to have really worked out for him, looking at how Alpine have started the season and how Aston Martin have started the season. So that's really interesting. I'm quite surprised by Mercedes. I think it's really interesting how they've kind of committed to this philosophy, and then after like one race have worked out that it's not the right philosophy after a whole year of having it last year. And that's kind of an interesting scenario, and I'm kind of intrigued to learn a bit more, I think, as probably the year goes on, and maybe towards the end of the season, some of the reasons for that, why they've gone down that rabbit hole and how they've come back from it, basically, or started to come back from it. So that's interesting. And then Ferrari obviously have not started the year as we probably expected, or at least not as they did last year. Kind of funny, I think I was kind of thinking about last year the other day, and Ferrari had started so strongly, and if you remember, we had Red Bull had quite a lot of reliability issues in the first few races last year, and Ferrari really stole the march and had that big lead with Charles Leclerc that they obviously was eroded over the second half of the season when Red Bull got the weight of their car down and were able to start stringing some proper results together, and Ferrari seemed to be throwing a lot away with a lot of the time their strategy situation, and this year it's kind of Ferrari have started in the Red Bull mold of struggling for reliability a little bit more, and Red Bull have obviously kicked on and had a really good start to the year. So it'll be interesting if Ferrari can pull something back like Red Bull did last year and come back into the championship fight. I think going up against Red Bull and Max Verstappen, that's going to be very unlikely, to be honest. But interesting start to the year. It's always, I know F1's not necessarily, it might be hard to get into for some American fans who are more used to like the NASCAR and IndyCar style of racing, where things are, tend to be a bit closer together and a bit more entertaining from back to front, as opposed to F1, which is, almost always 2 or 3 teams dominating things. And it's just a different style and just a different way of going racing and how a championship is sort of done. But I think Netflix and Drive to Survive really helped kind of open that market up to people in America. And I think, it would be nice to see more of the kind of Hamilton versus Verstappen, rivalry that we had, I guess a couple of years ago now. Seems like it was yesterday, but it's actually like almost 2 seasons ago. It'd be nice to see more of that. I don't really like to see Red Bull running away, but at the same time, props to them. They've built a brilliant car. They've got probably the best driver on the grid, or if not one of them, and they've designed the best package. So that's what F1's all about.
Yeah, it's quite interesting to see what F1's kind of doing. And we know, and then yeah, we won't talk about MotoGP. That's another subject for another day. But back to the reason why we asked you on here, because you know, with the start with this 2 races that we're in right now, of course Long Beach is next week. It just seems like there's a huge difference in, you know, where everyone's at in terms of teams. It's like, you know, it seems like it's kind of, do you think it's like a Joseph Newgarden type year? Because I think we saw it at Texas. Do you think he just goes off and rips off about, you know, 4 or 5, maybe even, I think it said it's even possible in this day and age that you can win 8 to 10 IndyCar races?
I don't think that's possible personally, but you know, I think the 5 that he won last year was like the ceiling of just how competitive IndyCar is these days. I think if you can win 5 races, that's extraordinary. It's not something that's easy to replicate, I don't think. Whether he can do that again, I'm not entirely sure. I think last year, obviously, his pre-season was really rushed in terms of finding a new engineer. He'd lost Gavin Ward, and then Eric Lightley came in, and there was a few other kind of personnel changes going on behind the scenes at the start of last season, and it all felt last minute. Even if some of it was probably a little bit more pre-planned than that sounds, it still felt like it was too close to the start of the season where some of these people were moving around or weren't confirmed, or we didn't really know what was happening. And of course, Joseph won the Texas race last year, which kind of I guess kicked off his season and gave people the confidence that he could go on and have a Joseph Newgarden type year. So I guess we're in exactly the same spot 1 year later. He's had an engine fire in the first race, so we don't really know what could have been possible there. I think probably a top 10, and then he's won Texas. So another first win for another engineer for Newgarden with Luke Mason. So that's interesting to see. But I think what I can say is the big difference for me in feeling with Newgarden for this season is that everything's been much more planned. The off season's been much more organised from Penske in terms of they knew which personnel was going to be, you know, with Newgarden in various significant roles, that they could really have a whole off season to work together. They got a proper pre-season test this year as well at Thermal together to get things rolling. And yeah, I think I honestly go into every year thinking it could be a Joseph Newgarden year because I just rate him so highly. I think he and Dixon are just you know, for me, still like another level of driver in IndyCar. They're both just so consistent and able to rip off these runs of winning races where you're just kind of like, how are they doing this? Like other people struggle to win 1 race in a season, like Will Power last year, and obviously he was able to. Will Power was able to be very consistent over the course of the year and won 1 race to Joseph Newgarden's 5 and still won the championship. So I think that shows you how consistent you have to be in IndyCar for sure, and that I think Joseph knows that and will be working very hard to be more consistent this year. But yeah, I guess the takeaway from all of that is that even though he won this race last year, he's in a much better place this year because things have been much more organised in his off season, and I think he's in a much better place.
For sure. You know, you talk about like a little bit of surprises. You got, you know, David Malukas is doing well with Coin and HMD, and then you got the 2 Juncos cars with Callum and Augustin. Just talk about them for a minute, but specific question on like Augustin there. Are you surprised that he's off to the start that he is, with him having only 2 races left? I know you had his strategist on last week. Just what's it been like over there with Juncos and trying to get him ready?
I think it was Augustin was a surprise kind of addition. I don't think anyone who works in IndyCar or who covers IndyCar would, you know, find, you know, be offended by me saying that everyone was kind of surprised by how quickly he's taken things on. And I think that's more a compliment to him as opposed to a negative or us like underrating him in a certain way or something before the season. He's just come in and been that good that, you know, no one could have expected him to be this good. And, you know, obviously he's a champion in Argentina, multiple champion in tin tops. And, you know, anyone who's a multiple champion in any decent national category is going to be a driver that you should be paying attention to. But it's the speed that he's got a hold of everything that is the incredible part of his journey. It's not just the, you know, I know the English gets talked about a lot, like he learned English in 3 months before the start of the season. And obviously that's incredibly impressive. I'm not taking anything away from that, but there's just been so many other things behind the scenes that have been, you know, incredibly impressive. For a start, he had like 2 fastest sectors at Thermal in the 2 fastest sections of the track. And there was areas that he was taking flat that other drivers didn't get to, didn't get flat over the course of the whole test. And he was, one of the few who was able to do it. And the slow speed is where you really need to lean on the tire and understand how the tire works, both in terms of the preparation of the tire, like how you warm it up and how you treat it over the course of a lap, but also, I guess, managing it over the course of a lap as well, and making sure you've got, you're not taking too much out of the tire where it's destroyed, as you get towards the end of a lap or whatever. So the management and the extraction of the pace from that tire is really important. And that's something you just can't really know as a rookie. You just have to learn about that kind of thing. And that's where I think he's probably losing, a lot of his time is in the slower speed corners on the road courses and the street courses. But yeah, the oval, wow, he had a great run at Texas. It was really, really impressive how he approached the weekend. Do you know what? It sounds like maybe a bit of a cliche, but when you speak to him, you can just kind of tell he's a champion. Like, he has an air of gravitas around him that when he speaks, you just kind of feel like this is a guy who has been there, he's done it, he's won the championships, he's won the races. He knows exactly what he's talking about. And the way he approaches everything is so, like, just really intelligent. Like, he's never got ridiculous, overestimations of what he's going to achieve in his first year. Like, the first weekend was, I want to finish the race. That's all I want to do. He did it really well, finished 12th. Texas, it's same again. I need to finish the race, but that was more for, the oval learning. He was really dizzy after the race. Like, he was struggling to sit on the pit wall while I was talking to him after the race day. He was really struggling. I think the physicality of an IndyCar can't be underestimated when you've raced tin tops your whole life. Like, the downforce and just the heat in the cockpit and everything. It's just it's a lot to take in for 250 laps around Texas when you're doing 220 odd miles an hour. So yeah, he's been so impressive. Callum's been just as impressive to me. Although I've known Callum now since, well, I don't know how many, I don't want to say how many years because it's going to make me feel old, but I've known Callum for a long time, let's say. And he's been, to have a 5th and a 9th, 2 top 10s. He had 2 top 10s in the whole of last season, and he's opened the year with 2 top 10s. It's a credit to how Juncos have approached this year. Expanding to a second car can be really difficult. We've seen that with other teams in the paddock. It's really, really tough, especially when you've not got a technical tie-up with any of the bigger teams. You're just kind of doing everything on your own and trying to find your way, and they're finding their way really quickly. It's been really impressive, and I think it's a really nice balance. The whole Juncos story shows how talented the drivers are. Like, they're able to show how good they are behind the wheel. Like, you can't look at Callum Ilot's results and think, would any driver in the series jump into that same situation and be able to get those results? I don't think there's many drivers that would. It's, he's obviously performing at a very high level. Same for Agustin as a rookie. Like, he's performing at an extremely high level, but also Juncos are giving them the car that can do that. It is partly them as well, and they've done a really good job as a whole as a team. So from what they've come from basically nothing to a 2-car team in the space of 2 and a little bit seasons, to have 2 cars in the top 12 in the championship after 2 races is, it can't really be played down. It's a really, really cool achievement, and I hope they're able to continue that consistency through the year in the same way that I hope David Malukas is as well. You mentioned him in your question there, and Hoyne is a team that is able to score pole positions, score wins, score podiums. It's done that consistently through its history, but what it's not really ever been able to do is do that consistently on a consistent basis. And David started with a 10th and a 4th across the first 2 races. So if he's able to keep that up, that's going to be phenomenal as well. And I know there's a lot of team bosses in the paddock that are keeping a very close eye on David Malukas and Callum Ilott. And why wouldn't you? I mean, they've had a fantastic start to the season.
Yeah. So let's talk about, there are teams doing well, and there are teams that aren't doing so well. And obviously, I think that one stands out from the rest. Do you know what's going on with Rahal?
It's been a tough start to the season for them. I think it's difficult you have to be careful not to try to kind of decide the faults based on 2 races. I think they've been 2 very different races, and there's kind of some similar things going on, but also some very different things as well. So like they had quite a few little niggly issues going on in qualifying at St. Pete, which really didn't help. I know Jack Harvey had a pretty significant issue, and that was really annoying for him because he'd been the best Rahal car across the first 2 practice sessions of the weekend and was really hopeful going into qualifying. I think can't remember the exact fault now. You'll have to look it up. But I think it was there was like maybe a stick in throttle or something along those lines in qualifying, which kind of hindered him a little bit. But then in the race, obviously, Graham and Christian were able to do quite a Ray Hall thing and kind of race through the field, be sensible, make good strategy decisions. Graham's really underrated when it comes to kind of wheel to wheel combat and, being able to make good aggressive overtakes while keeping his car really safe at the same time. I think it doesn't really get talked about very much, but I think he's really good at that and has a good balance for it. And I think Christian's in the same kind of mold. I think he's learning quite quickly how to race properly in IndyCar and do a good job of it. I think so basically from the street course setup, I'm not too worried. I think they had a lot of problems in qualifying, and I think they came good in the race. And I know a lot of people will say, a lot of people retired in that race and stuff like that, but I still think they would have been, in and around the back end of the top 10 there, or at least fighting for that, which is, given kind of how they started last season, is not, I don't think, the end of the world. Texas is a place where they've struggled for a few years now, and the problem they've got is they couldn't solve why the cars have understeer at the track quick enough to kind of get around it, which I think is kind of an underrated aspect of going racing at somewhere like Texas now. It's like, if you don't turn up with a car basically in the window, then you're trash basically, or you're starting from a really bad point. And it's difficult to come back when all of these other teams have turned up with cars that are like basically in the window and just need a bit of tweaking. Like, I think it was Tim Cindric who said they'd not changed Joseph Newgarden's car basically across basically like the practice and qualifying, which is, to be in that situation. If you're a Ray Hall, like, that would be fantastic to just roll the car off the truck and it'd be perfect and just drive it around in circles for the day. But that's obviously not where they're at, and they didn't really have enough time to get through the data and actually try and, pin down what this issue was. So it was a really tough weekend for them. They'll be keen to forget this, but they will have learned a lot from St. Pete. So going into Long Beach, I expect them to be, again, probably top 15, maybe top 20 qualifying, and then working their way through to the top 10 in the race. I think that's where they're at the moment. And I guess the other thing I'd add is, it's really disappointing to see them down there, because we know the resource they've got. They've got a new factory. They've got, significant people they've put in place, engineers. The drivers are better than where they're at now in the points. But I think we have to accept that they're on a bit of a journey at the minute, and we're basically at the start or in the first third of the journey of them coming back. I think, they struggled so much last season. They had to put so much work in the second half of the year to try and get back to where they wanted to be. And the problem is, when you get to an off season, everybody else makes a leap forward. So even if Ray Hall had made the biggest leap forward, they might have only just significantly nudged themselves a little bit closer towards the big teams, because the big teams were all making big leaps every year. We've seen how Aaron McLaren have started the year. I know we've not mentioned them yet, but when you look at how they've started the year, it's easy to see why these teams like Ray Hall are struggling, because if you get yourself into a hole where you've gone down the wrong kind of route with a setup direction or a car philosophy, it's really difficult to come back, because nobody's standing still. Everybody else is improving, and if you lose ground, it's really tough to get that back.
Yeah. Andretti, where are we at in those first two races? Because they're always, it's just an interesting thing to see. Just a lot of bad luck, and yeah.
You said it. They've had a lot of bad luck. I think I've written a feature for the race about Romain Grosjean. I spoke to him a couple of days ago, and it's basically the first part of the feature was like in an alternate universe here, like Romain Grosjean's leading the points and has won the first race of the year and probably finished in the top 3 in the second. And obviously that's not happened. He was kind of nudged into the tyres by Scott McLaughlin in the first race in St. Pete, and then Texas, still kind of on the fence a little bit as to whether that was his fault or whether it was a kind of an unavoidable incident, really. I guess it's not an unavoidable incident because he put his car in that position, but obviously it was dirty air that caused Roman to get loose. But he said, he was like backing off at the corner entry to try and avoid that happening, and he just needed, he said he needed a little bit more space from the guys around him. So it's a tough one when you're not behind the wheel to try and judge too much like what a driver's saying about it. But he seems to think that it wasn't, there's not really much he could do about it, and he's spoken to other drivers who've said the same thing to him. So that was really a pretty upsetting situation for him to to have been in position to basically be the best Andretti guy in the first 2 races, which, is, pretty a pretty significant step forward when you consider how last year went for him, struggling so much with understeering the car and really just not finding or struggling to find a good setup balance that didn't really come until the last sort of 4 or 5 races of the year there. So it's definitely been a really strong start to the season for him, and he's 15th. So it's really, and you can have the same, basically a very similar conversation about a couple of the other Andretti drivers as well, like Colton Herta's, obviously a bit higher in the points. I think he's 11th. He was taken out by Will Power at St. Pete, but finished 7th at Texas. So good bit of point scoring for him. I was really impressed by that, because I think he could have taken a few more risks at Texas and had a similar situation to Roman, but has put the points on the table, which is all you can really ask of Colton at this point. We know how fast he is and that he can win races and that he can score pole positions, but we really want him to see him be more consistent and be there, fighting for the championship on a more regular basis and get those super license points. So yeah, I think those two are obviously the Andretti spearheads, the guys they're relying on, and Kyle Kirkwood, obviously. Where do you kind of start with him? Like, you don't want to judge too harshly, but he's, he had last year, he had too many incidents, put himself in too many bad spots with Foyt, and I think kind of a little bit of a similar start to this year, really. I mean, he's shown such threatening speed that he's every bit as quick as Roman and Colton, in my opinion. Or if he's not quite there yet, then he will be. He's like in that bracket where it's not ridiculous to call him like in that group. I think with Roman and Colton, I think he every bit deserves to be there on pace. But yeah, just cutting out some of those errors and being a bit more consistent in the races has got to be the main target for him. Yeah, for sure. He's the really interesting one, in the sense that, I think there's so much upside there, but it's whether he can add that consistency. It's kind of a similar conversation to Colton, I guess, in that sense. So yeah, it's hard, there's only so many things you can blame on bad luck, but Andretti do seem to have more of it than everybody else. So read into that what you will. But I tend to kind of try to judge them as fairly as possible. And I think they do have a lot of things happen to them. Like Texas is a perfect example of that. Some of the things that's happened to them at Texas over the past like 3 or 4 years has been ridiculous. So yeah, I think just like, when I think, we want to see him up there, and that's not from any sort of bias. I'm obviously an unbiased journalist. I don't really, it doesn't really matter to me personally who's up there, but Andretti are a team that has the resources and the people to be up there fighting for the championship. And the more people fighting for the championship, the better it is. And that's, they should be up there competing for the championship every year, if not with one driver, then with 2 or 3. So, it's what everybody wants to see, is a close, championship fight at the front. And it's already been so good with the likes of Penske, Ganassi, McLaren. If you can add in Andretti and start to bring in some of the other teams as well, it just makes it so much more interesting.
Yeah. Talk about just some of the guys that have really impressed you so far in these first 2 races, and maybe some guys that really kind of haven't. I
think we've talked about the ones that have really impressed me with Augustin, Callum at Huncos, definitely, and David Lucas, who you rightfully mentioned as well. I think Alex Palou, as his performance at Texas was really a standout for me. St. Pete wasn't like barnstorming or anything. I think it was 8th in that race, but Texas was really, I don't like to use the word break, like overuse the word breakthrough, but because Alex has had good results at Texas before, but it just felt like, when you look at Alex Palou as an oval driver, obviously had the second in 2021 at the Indy 500, but apart from that, it seems like he's never really been someone who you pin as a favorite or someone who's going to win the race. He's always someone who's, he's probably going to score you a top 10, but he's going to struggle to fight for the victory. But at Texas, he was there all day, did a really good job, and it felt like he deserved to be there and belong there. Even on old tires at the end of the race, he was still, pushing Newgarden and Pato as well. So yeah, that Texas performance really impressed me, and obviously Pato, I think, has had a fantastic start to the year. He'll be really upset that he's basically had 2 wins, slip away from him for different reasons. Obviously, the mechanical issue at St. Pete and the caution finishing the Texas race. But I think he's approached it from a really mature angle and perspective of, yes, you know, I could have had 2 wins, but I've got 2 seconds and I'm leading the championship, and I've struggled to start the championship well in the past. Obviously, he's leading the championship now, so he really can't be upset with that. And the number of changes that Aaron McLaren went through in the off season, adding, you know, so many personnel and changing things up and adding another car, I think for them to be leading the championship with the driver is, you know, really impressive after everything they've kind of been through. You know, you're talking about Ray Hall being on a long journey, you know, adding people, moving people around, all that kind of stuff. We've seen how the opposite way that can go with McLaren. You know, they've brought the right people in. Those people have had a really big effect, and it hasn't upset the team too much to the point where it's changed their performance too much. So that's been really interesting. I think I would have liked to have seen maybe a little bit more from the 2 rookies that we haven't talked about, Benjamin Pedersen and Stingray Robb. I think you know, I think Stingray Robb really, he needed to get to the end of the Texas race and really get some laps. And I'm really keen to see how he kind of develops through the year, because he's basically got you know, in my opinion, he's got a better junior CV or resume than David Malukas, in the sense that obviously Stingray was the Indy Pro 2000 champion, also finished second in Indy Lights like David Malukas did. But if you look at his results on a piece of paper, basically, is what I'm saying, it's probably you would probably take Stingray Robb's over David Malukas's. And yet David Malukas is, you know, at the like, had a bit of a slow start to last season, and then turned things around kind of mid-season, and is now kind of establishing himself as one of the most exciting, you know, American drivers coming up. So I'm interested to see if Stingray Robb can perform, you know, a similar kind of you know, turnaround in the mid-season here, and whether it's going to take him that long to adapt to IndyCar, learn a bit more about, you know, what it takes to get to the end of these races. And you know, it's difficult to crash out of your first 2 races for sure. It takes away a lot of laps. It, you know, it demotivates you, and, you know, demotivates your team a little bit around you as well, to a certain extent. So the one thing that was good was that I really liked that, even though he felt like it wasn't 100% his fault, the Texas crash, that he took responsibility for it basically, and said, you know, I've ruined this with my guys, basically, he was saying in the post-race interview. So I like when a driver steps up and takes responsibility for things like that, and that's a sign of maturity. So it'll be really interesting to see if he can turn things around in the second half of the season.
Yeah. So of course, no race this weekend. Long Beach, of course, is the next IndyCar race. Yeah, they're gonna start coming, Jack. So it's what's it gonna be like? Because we're on a street course, and then the first road course of the year, and then we head to the month of May with the Indy GP and then the 500. So what are we gonna expect to see out of these next 4? And really, what are we gonna expect out of Long Beach this weekend? What are we or next weekend, I should say, when we go there?
It's a difficult one. I think there's going to be a lot of pressure on these teams. There's such a short turnaround now between the races, heading towards the 500. Obviously, all of the teams are. IndyCar's like, you have to have 2 eyes. Like, you've got one eye always focused on the 500, and then the other eye kind of focuses on everything else. So we've got this period now where there's basically no breaks between the races. Even if there is breaks, as in not having a race, there's going to be like work to do for those teams in between. There's a lot of car preparation to turn around, a lot of simulation to do. We've talked about how important it is in IndyCar now at the moment to show up and have a car that is on the pace almost immediately, or needs like minimal changes, because the standard of the other teams around you is so high that it's going to be really difficult. So I'm really looking at the teams to see how they handle this kind of turnaround period, where they have to go through so many different things of focusing on the 500. Obviously, there's going to be the 500 test in there as well. So that's going to be, you know, something that they have one eye on, but they're also going to have to be, you know, rapid fire machine gun turnaround for all the other races that they're going to have, which also involves 2 different types. You've got the street course and the road course as well, like you said. So really interesting period to see how the teams handle that, and whether any of the teams are able to make a bit of an improvement on that sense, or if any of them are going to fall behind because of these kind of difficulties that they have to go through. I think Long Beach, we had obviously Newgarden win last year, and I think Colton Hurt was on pole as well, wasn't he? So I expect to see the same kind of usual street course guys up there. I think Roman and Marcus Ericsson will be up there for sure. Some of those kind of street course regulars you expect to see up there: Scott McLaughlin, Alex Palou. Dixon will be sneaky in there somewhere as well for sure. But yeah, really looking forward to that one. Actually, I think it's a really nice opportunity, Long Beach, because we kind of have St. Pete, a month of like time for the teams to digest what's happened there, and then they go into Texas and then back to Long Beach. So although Long Beach and St. Pete are not the same by any stretch of the imagination, even if they're a road course, it's a lot more complicated than that. It's not like we've got one street course set up, like that's what we're going to use at Long Beach. It's obviously different, but I think the general package they will have done some work with at St. Pete, and they'll at least have a read going into Long Beach as to where they're at and what they need to do. So that'll be a really nice, I think, opportunity to kind of analyze where the field's at in terms of the street course performance, because it'll be the second time we get to see them, you know, kind of in that configuration. So that's going to be really interesting. And then we'll go into the road course for the first time, which is always fun. There always seems to be like a mistake on the first lap there at Barber where people don't quite get it right. And there's a lot of trial and error through the weekend trying to perfect these road course setups that the guys have been, you know, either on the shaker rig in the off season or, you know, working on their dampers, working in the sim, wind tunnel, everything. And they, you know, finally get to see if all of that correlates against what they've been, you know, doing in the off season at Barber at the road course. So yeah, really looking forward to all of those races. They all pose an interesting challenge. Barber especially is like a proper, probably what you would call like a more European type road course, which is always, you know, great for an IndyCar, like the undulating fast corners, all of that kind of stuff is always really fun to watch in IndyCar. So yeah, we'll be looking forward to that. And then before you know it, we'll be at the GP and the 500. So yeah, and then we're almost halfway through the year, which is bonkers. Yeah,
it will be. It will be. Year's gonna fly by before you know it.
Yeah, man.
Jack, thanks so much for coming on and talking with us. And we'll talk to you soon. We'll maybe talk to you maybe in a few months, maybe after 500. I don't know.
Yeah, happy to come back. I've enjoyed it. Thanks so much.